crappy little games. Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to each and everyone out there in YouTube land. For my Christmas video this year, I'm going to do something just a little bit different. With all the sleigh bells ringing, gifts giving, candy cane eating, and eggnog drinking, I thought it would be a good time to showcase a little bit of Christmas cheer instead of Christmas cheer and talk about some of the worst arcade conversions ever made. I'm going to span all the way from the Wii Atari 2600 up to the 16-bit consoles and beyond. These are not just video clips from my previous documentaries, as I have gone through and replayed these games to get a fresh perspective on how bad they really are. So sit back and relax while I endure the pain of not only having these nipple clamps on, but a little bit of bah humbug when it comes to these terrible conversions. Oh, and before I forget, Merry Queefmas to all, and to all a good night. These are the worst arcade conversions ever. Let's start things off by looking at a few bad conversions of Double Dragon. As much as I hate to say it, my much beloved Amiga had a number of bad arcade conversions, with one of the worst being Double Dragon. Once the game starts up, you get a nice title screen with some music playing, but after that, nothing but the occasional grunts and groans from the enemies. While the backgrounds look really good, the characters themselves do look a bit odd. Billy and Jimmy look like they are now sporting afros, and everything just has a real low quality feel to it. Some of the enemy sprites look okay, such as a Bobo. As far as the controls, you are stuck with only one fire button, so obviously sacrifices had to be made. It wouldn't be so bad if the gameplay was any good, but unfortunately that's just not the case. It controls like a wet noodle. Moving on down to the 8-bits, there were actually two versions of the game for the Commodore 64, with both of them turning out a bit stanky. The first one, by Binary Design, features extremely bland graphics and poor controls to boot. The company also produced the ZenX Spectrum version, which makes the 64 version look spectacular in comparison. While the character graphics are large, everything runs at a snail's pace, and as far as the audio goes, you only get short, sweet quiffs here and there. A couple of years later, Ocean Software released their own version of Double Dragon for the 64 with slightly better graphics and gameplay. But that's like comparing two different turds. One of my favorite early run-and-gun platformers would have to be Rolling Thunder. The NES conversion was really well done and featured excellent gameplay, smooth scrolling, and even the cutscenes in between levels. Developer of the Year TierTex were in charge of all the home computer ports, and they utilized their reverse King Midas touch, turning chicken salad into chicken crap. While a couple of these are not bad, none of them capture the arcade feel of Rolling Thunder. For starters, across all home computer ports, once again, you only have one fire button. To jump up, you push up on the joystick. To jump up on a platform, you press up and the fire button. To get down from the platform, what do? You press up and the fire button. Who in their right mind designed this control scheme? Also, the gameplay takes place inside of a small window which clearly does not help the speed at all. The most playable version in my opinion is the Spectrum port with its urine colored graphics, and although it's not very smooth, the abstract version looks and plays pretty good. But then you have some of the bad ones like the Commodore 64. Although the scrolling is smooth, the graphics are very blocky and everything has a dull color to it thanks to the 64's palette. As I've mentioned once before, there appears to be a door thief on the loose because they are all missing. The sound effects and music are not too bad, but the SID chip is capable of oh so much more. The gameplay itself though is a bit on the slow side. The Amiga version of Rolling Thunder should have been a fairly competent conversion, especially considering the hardware. The scrolling is a stuttering mess even though the game takes place inside of a tiny window. The sprites are large and fairly detailed, but the vibrant colors from the arcade game have been reduced quite a bit. Whereas the arcade game featured a number of hooded enemies that were all different colors, this one features only one. The same lame jumping mechanics from the 8-bit ports apply here. And this time we even have a bit of moon gravity going on because you float down from the upper platforms with feather-like tendencies. The frantic gameplay from the arcade game is also missing due to only 3 enemies appearing on screen at once. Now that's probably a good thing because the gameplay is very stiff with some questionable hit detection. The game would have been a whole lot more playable if it had been sped up by about 50%. The sound effects feature some nice digitized samples and they sound pretty good. Also, we get music and sound effects while we play, which is really good, but everything else is really, really bad. Now the Atari ST version is even worse than the Amiga. The colors have taken a hit from the Amiga and the gameplay window is even smaller. The music has also been downgraded over its Amiga counterpart, but the speed has been improved just a bit. Doesn't matter though, because it still features the same skanky gameplay. Altered Beast rampaged its way into the arcades, telling all of its players to rise from their graves and kick some serious booty. After playing some of these home conversions, I wish I would have stayed in my grave. The arcade game featured large sprites and excellent sound and smooth scrolling. Although the gameplay is a bit iffy, it was a lot of fun. Most of the home computer versions were developed by a software studios, aside from the rather decent conversion for the PC, which was done by DSi, although the sound is lacking. The Amiga version looks okay, but the gameplay is extremely slow and there is no music on the first level for some odd reason. The game does feature some digitized samples and the music is pretty good. Too bad it controls terribly. Now we get to the 8-bit ports, which are downright queef nasty. The Spectrum version is a downright mess. It's as if somebody ate a box of Crayolas and threw them up all over the screen. If everything were monochrome, at least we would be able to make out the details. Unfortunately, they tried to use color, but the clash is so bad you almost go cross-eyed from looking at it. It is fairly speedy and you do get music while you play, but the gameplay is lackluster. A plus is given for including the arcade intros, intermissions, and ending screens from the arcade game. Now, if you loved the arcade game but thought the action was just way too fast, then check out the Amstrad version. This game looks more like a slideshow than anything else, but at least we have color that doesn't make your eyeballs bleed. The quote, action, unquote, takes place inside of a tiny window and it plays awful. Half the time, the game doesn't even register your joystick movements. There is music while we play, which isn't half bad. Final Fight had a number of good conversions, in particular the Sega CD version, but let's be honest, none of the home computer ports aside from the X68000 were any good. While graphically, the Amiga version doesn't look too bad with large detailed sprites and 2 player simultaneous action. The problem comes with the horrible gameplay thanks to a couple of different factors. Once again, we have only one fire button, which definitely takes some getting used to, but it doesn't matter because the game is monotonous. The game was programmed by Richard Alpin, who has made it abundantly clear he absolutely hated beat-em-ups and found them quite boring to play, saying he would rather be playing Shinobi. This crappy attitude translated into the crappy gameplay for Final Fight because it is downright tedious. The animation is choppy, making for herky-jerky gameplay. To be fair, the game is fast and it does include the in-game intros. There are some nice digitized samples when it comes to the actual sound effects, but there is no in-game music whatsoever. Mr. Alpin had also done conversions of Double Dragon 2 for the Amiga, which was really well done. One of the worst conversions of the game would have to be the Commodore 64 version. While the backgrounds look nice with a good amount of color, the character sprites somewhat resemble the arcade original if you walk backwards 60 paces and spin around 3 times. The not so great graphics could be forgiven if it played any good, but as you can imagine, it does not. Stiff controls and slow gameplay is a match made in hell when it comes to this game. As I've mentioned numerous times over the 4.5 years I've been doing these documentaries, Pac-Man was an absolute phenomenon when it was released during the golden age of arcades. It was soon announced that Atari was going to be bringing home the arcade classic for spoiled little brats everywhere. The game was a huge success, selling over 7 million copies, but it was downright dreadful. Everything from the graphics to the sounds were horrendous, and the mazes didn't even look like the arcade game. There are better examples of crappy conversions on this list, but due to the historical significance of this game, I had to include it. By the way, Atari made more copies of the game than there were 2,600 units sold at the time, because they were sure people would rush out to purchase a brand new Atari to play Pac-Man. Of course, a lot of these unsold copies ended up in a landfill in the desert. Chase HQ is a fantastic racing game and it's definitely in my top 10 of all time. There were some pretty good home conversions for the 8-bit line of computers such as the Amstrad and Spectrum, but the absolute worst goes to the moldy old Commodore 64. I don't know what's going on here. This looks like it was thrown together after a Friday night bender and turned in on that Monday morning. The scrolling green road makes it look like a Spectrum port but with a small splash of color thrown in. The gameplay is also sluggish with no sense of high-octane speed at all. The droning of the engine and the siren definitely put you in the queef zone. Pit Fighter is one of my favorite fighters from the early 1990s. When I saw it was coming to my beloved Amiga, I was very excited because I thought it would turn out pretty well. But that's what I get for being a young, dumb teenager. While the Amiga version isn't the bag of chips we all hoped it would be, I didn't think it turned out that bad despite only having one fire button and lackluster sound. The first version of Pit Fighter I want to showcase is the Amstrad version. Holy Toledo, is this slow. The animation is so choppy I thought I was looking at a flipbook. I think I counted 2 frames per second, but I could be mistaken. Thanks to the choppy animation and slow speed, the gameplay is terrible. It does feature in-game music as well as the arcade's attract screen. This was clearly a port of the Spectrum version, which I might as well go ahead and mention. All you need to do is take everything from the Amstrad version and speed it up by 100%. One other version I want to showcase is the Super Nintendo port. The Genesis version was released first and it was pretty spectacular when it came to the gameplay and audio, but the graphics left a little bit to be desired considering how small the sprites were. When I read that the Super Nintendo version was coming, I was as happy as a puppy with 2 Peters. Once I got home and played it for just a few minutes, I knew something was seriously wrong. The controls are broke as a joke with a huge delay in between button presses. The animation isn't as bad as some of the other 8-bit ports, but that doesn't mean it's any good either. There is no arcade intro, and something else that is missing continues. Once you die, the game takes you right back to the title screen. Also, after winning a fight, you would think that you would get a little bit of a health increase, but no, that would be for sissies. If you've never played this game before, then consider yourself lucky. When the arcade game Hard DriveIn was released, it was a thing of beauty. No other arcade game realistically portrayed the inner workings of driving a car than this game did. This game actually helped me learn how to drive a stick, which would come in handy those late, lonely nights sitting in my bedroom when I was 13 years old. Now I'm going to lump in both Hard DriveIn and its follow-up Race DriveIn into one package when talking about these horrible conversions. While some other competent conversions of Race DriveIn would come out years later, such as on the Sega Saturn, we were treated to an MS-DOS version here in the States, and it was really good with a nice, smooth frame rate and pretty good playability. When talking about the bad conversions of Race DriveIn and Hard DriveIn, a few instantly spring to mind. The first one is for the Super Nintendo. Rather than use the FX chip which powered such games as Star Fox, this game relied solely on the internal Super Nintendo's hardware, and boy does it show. Supposedly, the programmer and graphic designer of this game also designed the game of Hero for the Atari 2600, which is one of my favorite games. Perhaps he should have stuck with 2D. The graphics are beyond ridiculous with abstract cows and barns littering the highway. The frame rate is an absolute joke, which sees it get between 3 to 5 frames per second. Now, I've played choppy games before, but as long as the gameplay is okay, then I can deal with it, but that's not the case here. You're sliding all over the road at the drop of a hat. People like to talk about how bad the Amiga version is, but at least that one is somewhat playable. The Atari Lynx produced a fantastic version of Stun Runner, but their version of Hard DriveIn was absolutely terrible. The frame rate is extremely slow and the collision detection is awful. And last, but certainly least when it comes to the Hard DriveIn series, is the Commodore 64 version. The Spectrum version has a decent frame rate and is somewhat playable, but this one is an absolute joke. This looks like a horrible Spectrum port, only this time utilizing bad cardboard cutouts for the objects. I dare anyone to try this for 30 seconds without pulling your hair out. Everything starts out just fine, but as soon as you try to make that first curve, you are bobbing side to side like my wife after a typical night at the bar. And the skidding sound effects as a result of you bobbing from side to side pierces into your brain extremely quickly. As the story goes, this was a last-minute replacement for the 64 as the original programmer walked off the project. They had to get something put together as quick as possible to meet deadlines, so they found someone willing to give it a shot. So what we have here is the result of 2 weeks, that's right, 2 weeks of programming. The programmer admitted that both the Spectrum and 64 versions share assets, but at least, and I quote, "the Commodore 64 dashboard will be more colorful." And you'll have plenty of time looking at those colors in between frames. The game was so bad that it wasn't sold as a full price release, only as part of a compilation or strictly as a budget title. Another 1990s classic arcade game gets the dire conversion treatment, and it goes by the name of Narc. The arcade game used smooth gameplay and slick digitized graphics, paving the way for such titles as Mortal Kombat. We did receive a couple of stinkers when it came to the conversion department. First up is the NES version, which seems rather odd that it would appear on the system at all considering all the drug references that were in the game. Anything drug related was stripped out, so instead of you busting all those various flashing crackheads with their bags of nose candy, now you get to bust men in trench coats who apparently have a sweet tooth because they have dropped all their bags of sugar. Did they strip out the violence? Absolutely not. Drugs on the NES equals no way, while violence on the NES is A-OK. There was no way they could replicate the digitized graphics on the humble 8-bit NES, but what we have here is very basic. The sprites look like something I was doing on my Commodore 64 back in 1985. The scrolling is smooth, but the animation is very choppy and the game is just a bore to play. The other horrible conversion that is worth mentioning is the Amstrad version. The game runs in a small window, which I would assume is an attempt to speed up the gameplay, but clearly it doesn't work. If the developers were going for a modern art vibe on this title with their blobs of color, then mission accomplished. Also, the game is as slow as a turtle fart. The scrolling is extremely choppy and we're looking at 2 to 3 frames per second. As far as the sound goes, apparently there is a lot of SPD going around, so perhaps that's something we should be thankful for this holiday season. There you have it, my friends. These are some of the worst arcade conversions ever. There were a lot that didn't make the list, so if you'd like me to go back and showcase a few more, let me know in the comments down below. Also, what were some of the ones you can recall that I didn't cover? I hope everyone has a happy holiday and a merry, merry new year. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also, if you would like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. If you would like to contribute but not sign up for my Patreon, you could always use the donate button up above. Thanks everybody for watching.